Okay. Good morning, everybody. Sorry about the delay. I actually recorded an entire lecture and then realized that I wasn't recording at all. So my voice is a little scratchy now, and we're a little behind schedule. The first thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about is the announcement that I made. I'm not sure if anybody saw it yet, but basically, I just want you guys to know that I'm going to be uploading this lecture in 2 different videos. I know that it can be a little bit hard to focus for the online experience, so I think that maybe if I post it in 2 separate halves, it'll hopefully be a little bit more digestible for you guys. And then the second thing that I wanted to talk about is the fact that I did receive a handful of emails from people freaking out about their grades on their exams because they hadn't realized that the grade that they saw was out of about somewhere around 70 points. You still have 30 or so points of open-ended questions that I have to grade. So if you ended up with a 60 on the exam and you were like totally alarmed by that, that's a 60 out of 70, not a 60 out of 100. So I still have, again, 30 more points or so to grade for you guys. So nobody freak out. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about today is the lymphatic system. Then I'll circle back around with a second video and do the immune system. So your lymphatic system consists of a network of different vessels and tissues and organs all throughout your body that you see in this picture here in green. And those include your lymph nodes, your spleen, which is right here, your thymus above the heart, the tonsils, which are right here at the back of the mouth, and then also red bone marrow, which you see right here in the picture. So there's 3 different functions of the lymphatic system that we're going to talk about today, and the first of those functions is fluid recovery. So we already know about the function of the blood capillaries from the last section of the book that we covered, and so we see those capillaries here, and they're going to filter fluid into the tissues. And so they'll reabsorb about 85% of that fluid that they filter into the tissues, but that remaining 15% isn't going to be reabsorbed by the capillaries and instead needs to be absorbed by the lymphatic system. So that's one function of the lymphatic system. It returns the fluid from your tissues back to your blood. And so here in this picture we see the capillaries, the blood capillaries, and then we see lymphatic capillaries are in green. Another function of the lymphatic system is immunity. So the lymphatic system, we know by now, picks up the fluid from the tissues, and its job is to bring it back into circulation. But as it does this, it's also going to absorb different foreign cells and chemicals and cellular wastes that we don't want. And in order to get rid of those, as the fluid passes through these nodes, which you see all over the body, there are these little bean-shaped organs that are sort of connected to the lymphatic vessels, they're going to act as a filter, so sort of like filtering your water through a Brita. And what we have in those nodes is immune cells, and so those immune cells basically take the lymph or the fluid, tissue fluid, as it's coming through, and all of those immune cells that exist within the nodes are going to combat the different foreign matter that exists in the lymph. And then the final function of the lymphatic system, which we're not really going to get too much into, I'm sure we will when we talk about the digestive system, is lipid absorption. So within the small intestine, we take this picture here, for example, we take a cross section of the small intestine, and it has all of these little folds that you see here, and there, right here and here. And then within all of the folds, we have these little villi that create sort of this shag rug appearance. And if you take a cross section of one of those villi, you'll see inside there are 2 capillaries, or a capillary. And then we also have a lacteal here in the green in the center here. So lacteals are basically just specialized vessels of the lymphatic system, and their job is to absorb fat molecules from the small intestine that are too big to be absorbed by the capillaries. Okay, so the components of the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is made up of lymph, which we see indicated in green here in this picture. That's not really what it looks like, but that's how your book helps you to recognize it. And that's just the fluid that's recovered from the vessels. or from the lymphatic tissue. The lymphatic vessels transport the lymph. So here's an individual lymphatic vessel. And you can see them all throughout the body here, and then integrated with the capillaries. The lymphatic tissue is just tissue that consists of different lymphatic cells, and we'll talk about those cells as we move through the slides today. It also consists of macrophages, and so we find lymphatic tissue in different organs throughout the body. And then finally we have lymphatic organs, which are organs that are especially concentrated with these lymphatic cells or with the lymphatic tissues. So lymph, even though it's green in your book, is actually a clear colorless fluid. It's really similar to plasma, but the color does and consistency changes a little bit depending on where the lymph is collected from. If it's collected from tissues that are surrounding the digestive tract, it'll be a little bit more milky in consistency because, again, one of the functions is the absorption of that lipid content. So lymph starts as a tissue fluid that's taken up by lymphatic vessels, and as it passes through the lymphatic system, it's going to pass through nodes, and as it passes through those nodes, it's going to encounter lymphocytes. It also contains other components like macrophages, and then some things that we don't want, like bacteria, viruses, cellular debris, and then cancer cells. So lymphatic vessels are really similar to blood vessels, but obviously carry lymph instead of blood. Okay, so the first of the lymphatic vessels that we're going to talk about today are lymphatic capillaries. And lymphatic capillaries, you can see right here in green again, they're very similar to blood capillaries, but the difference is that they're closed at one end. Okay, so the capillaries are sort of continuous like this, and or the blood capillaries are continuous in that way, but the lymphatic capillaries have this blunt or closed ends. And they're made of really thin overlapping endothelial cells, so you can see them down here. They're sort of like shingles on a roof. Okay, and what that does is it creates these big gaps here. And so those gaps are important because they allow for easy uptake of different tissue materials like bacteria, also lymphocytes, and different cellular waste, stuff like that. Okay, and so they respond to changes in pressure. If the lymphatic tissues have, like out here, have a lot of fluid in them, then the pressure outside of the vessel is going to be greater than the pressure inside the vessel. And so what that does is, because the pressure out here is so great, it's going to push on these overlapping endothelial cells and cause them to open so that fluid can rush into the cell. And that's how we get fluid from the tissues into the lymphatic vessels. On the other hand, when the pressure outside of the vessels is really low, and the pressure inside the vessels is really high, that means that the pressure in here is going to be greater than the pressure out here, and so these valves or these flaps are going to be sealed closed really tightly, and so we don't get any fluid coming in or moving out. Okay, a little bit more about lymphatic vessels. The larger lymphatic vessels have really similar structure to veins. So there is a tunica interna, which is made up of that really thin endothelium, and they also have valves. Okay, and that's important because, like veins, the fluid or the lymph that travels within these lymphatic vessels moves at really low pressure. We'll talk about that a little bit more as we move through, but we know, just like veins moving at low pressure, we need these valves to help maintain a one-way flow of blood, so that that lymph is not traveling in the opposite direction. Then we have the tunica media, which is the middle layer containing elastic fibers and smooth muscle, and then the externa, which is just the thin outer layer. So again, very similar to veins. So what you should be gathering by now is just this sort of general overview of how we recycle fluid in our body, right? So we have these capillaries that are going to filter fluid into, or fluid into the tissues. Okay, so it starts as blood, then it becomes tissue fluid. 85% of that is going to be reabsorbed by those same capillaries, but the remaining 15% is going to be absorbed by our lymphatic system, which will then carry the lymph up and deposit it into the veins so that it can go back to the heart and be recycled into circulation. Okay, so the way that it does that is through the lymphatic capillaries, which are down here and articulate with the blood capillaries, and then it goes into these collecting vessels that you see here, and then it goes into the lymphatic trunks, and then the collecting ducts, and then into the veins to go to the heart. So the first of those vessels that we'll talk about is the collecting vessels, and they receive lymph from these lymphatic capillaries, right? So here's our lymphatic capillaries, here's our collecting vessels, and these collecting vessels travel alongside the veins and arteries, all right? So that's going to become important later, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but basically what you need to know about these collecting vessels is that they pass through all of these little nodes. And so those nodes are again important because they act as our Brita filter. They have those phagocytes and immune cells that are going to filter the lymph as it passes through and combat all of the bacteria and waste materials and foreign antigens that they're carrying. The lymphatic trunks, which we see right here, just receive lymph from the collecting vessels. We have 6 major pairs, except the intestinal is singular, not paired. I don't necessarily care that you guys memorize all of these. I just want you to know that there's 6 major pairs of lymphatic trunks that drain different major portions of the body. So I have them listed here if you'd like to look at them. And then finally, collecting ducts receive lymph from the lymphatic trunks. Okay, so we have 2 really big these are the 2 largest lymphatic vessels of the body. The right lymphatic duct, which you see right up here, receives drainage from the right arm and the right side of the thorax and the right side of the head and neck. Okay, so this right upper portion of the body. And it drains into the right subclavian vein. So that's right here, and you're seeing you have that right lymphatic duct draining right there. The thoracic duct is much larger and much longer than the right lymphatic duct. So here's the thoracic duct. It runs right in front of the spinal column. And it's larger and longer because it basically collects drainage from all of the rest of the body. So everything below the diaphragm, and then also the left side of the head, neck, thoracic region, and arm. And that's going to drain into the left subclavian vein. So you see it comes up like this and then drains right here. So this deposits into here. Okay, so that's your thoracic duct. Okay, flow of lymph. So we touched on this a little bit already, but basically the flow of lymph is really interesting because unlike the blood vessels, the lymphatic system has no pump. Okay, so the blood vessels, like the arteries and the veins, they rely a lot on the heart to sort of pump blood through the system. The lymphatic system doesn't have that same pump, and so it depends on a lot of other mechanisms, and some of them are very similar to venous blood return, and that's because venous blood also travels at really low pressures compared to arterial blood. So what we see here in this picture over here is contraction of the lymphatic vessels. So these lymphatic vessels are going to contract, and as they contract, they'll push lymph through, and then these valves are valves are going to close. Okay, so that's going to maintain a one-way flow of blood. And then also, they run adjacent to blood vessels. Okay, so the blood vessels are receiving this rhythmic pulsation of the heart, and that creates a rhythmic pulsation of the lymphatic vessels as well, just due to the fact that they run alongside of them. The skeletal muscle pump, if you recall from venous blood return, when you're exercising and your muscles are contracting, they're going to massage the veins, which will push the blood up through the veins, and then the valves will close. Okay, so those valves close so that the blood can't return in the opposite direction. And so that's a skeletal muscle pump. The respiratory pump, similar to venous blood return. If you remember, when we inhale, the diaphragm moves down because it relaxes. So the space up top here gets bigger, and that means the pressure here goes down. At the same time, the abdominal cavity gets smaller, right? Because the diaphragm is moving into this space, the abdominal cavity shrinks, which increases the pressure in this region. And we know that fluid likes to move from high to low pressure, so it's going to want to get out of the abdominal region and move up towards the heart. And so just like venous return, lymph also flows in conjunction with this respiratory pump. And then finally, I don't have any pictures of this on this slide, but once the blood returns to the subclavian vein, the blood flow within the subclavian vein is so fast that it pulls the lymph into it from the collecting duct. Okay, now we're going to talk about lymphatic cells. So these are just the cells that make up the lymphatic tissue. And again, they can either be scattered throughout mucous membranes of places like our respiratory tract, our urinary tract, our digestive tract, or they can be more compact in different lymphatic organs. Okay, and they're composed of a variety of different white blood cells. Like here we see lymphocytes, and other defense or immune cells. So we're going to talk about each of them in a little bit more detail, starting with natural killer cells, or NK cells. So their job is to patrol the body for pathogens or diseased host cells. And if you're not familiar with the term host cell, it basically just means a cell that is of your own body, but that's maybe been infected by a virus or cancer or whatever it is. So these natural killer cells, they're going to target things like bacteria, cells of transplanted organs or tissues. So remember we talked about antigens when we talked about blood type, and your body basically uses these antigens to recognize which cells are my own and which cells are from a foreign material. And so when people receive transplants, sometimes their bodies don't recognize the antigens and they'll mark them for destruction. Okay, so natural killer cells have a place in that process. They'll also target cells that are infected with viruses and cancer cells, which we talked about already. So the way that they function is that they basically bind to the enemy cell, which you have here. So here's your natural killer cell binding to an enemy cell, and they release these little guys here called perforins. And those perforins perforate the membrane of the cell. So they create a hole in the membrane of the cell, and then the natural killer cell releases these granzymes. The granzymes enter into the enemy cell through this little perforation that they've created, and they destroy all of the enzymes inside of the enemy cell. And so when they do that, the enemy cell dies, and a big macrophage is going to come along and consume it, or phagocytize it. T cells and B cells are other types of lymphatic cells. T cells mature in the thymus, which we can remember because thymus starts with T. B cells mature in the bone marrow, which we can remember because bone marrow starts with B. Okay, so T cells, basically their job is they're presented with antigens by something called an antigen-presenting cell. And we'll talk about antigen-presenting cells as we move through, and I'll give you some more examples. But basically what they do is they consume an antigen, they chop it up into little pieces, and they basically expose these fragments of the antigen to cells like T cells. Okay, so that's what the antigen-presenting cells do. They expose the fragments of antigens to the T cells, and in response, the T cells will trigger an immune response. B lymphocytes, or B cells, develop into plasma cells that secrete antibodies. So you can see both of these are really important in immune function. Macrophages are another type of lymphatic cell. They're really large phagocytic cells. Okay, so we should all know what phagocytic means by now. It means that they basically engulf foreign material. And they develop from monocytes, which hopefully you remember is one of your types of leukocytes. So they're going to target things like tissue debris, dead neutrophils, which is another type of leukocyte that plays a big role in the immune system. They'll target bacteria and other types of foreign matter. So again, we just touched on antigen-presenting cells, but just a reminder, a macrophage is an example of an antigen-presenting cell in that it basically chops up this foreign matter and displays its fragments of antigens to the T cells so that the T cells can signal an immune response. Dendritic cells and reticular cells are other types of antigen-presenting cells. So again, they chop up foreign matter, expose the antigens to some type of cell like a T cell to signal an immune response. And dendritic cells themselves are interesting because they are mobile and they function really similarly to macrophages. There's some small differences that basically make them unable to be classified as a macrophage, but they function the same way in that they internalize an antigen and then move towards the lymph node in order to activate an immune response. Okay, so those are our lymphatic cells. So lymphatic cells make up lymphatic tissues. So lymphatic tissues are just aggregations of these cells. And again, so they can either be in mucous membranes where they're found more diffusely or in organs where they're found more compactly. Okay, so diffuse lymphatic tissue is basically tissue that has more scattered lymphocytes. And again, we find these in our mucous membranes. It's really common in membranes that are exposed to the external environment. So things like our respiratory tract, our digestive tract, our urinary and reproductive tracts, those are all exposed to the external environment. So they'll have more diffuse lymphatic cells. Lymphatic nodules, on the other hand, are more dense congregations of lymphocytes and macrophages. So you see a picture here, you can see all these cells really densely compact here. And they're not typically constant. So what that means is these nodules can basically come and go depending on your immune status. If you're fighting something and you need more lymphatic cells, then maybe we find more of these lymphatic nodules. But other times, maybe we find less of them. So there are some parts of the body where they're not really constant, but they are relatively constant in places like your lymph nodes, your tonsils, and your appendix. Which brings us to our next topic of lymphatic organs. So lymphatic organs are basically lymphatic tissues, but with well-defined anatomical sites. Okay, so that means that they're going to be separated from surrounding tissues by some sort of connective tissue capsule. We have primary lymphatic organs and secondary lymphatic organs. So the primary are where these lymphocytes go to mature. Okay, so red bone marrow is one. That's where our B cells mature. You see that in the picture right here. And then the thymus is where T cells mature. So you see that right up here. And then the secondary lymphatic organs is basically the places throughout the body where those lymphocytes go after they're done maturing or after they've become immunocompetent, meaning that they can combat an antigen. So they're going to go to places like the lymph nodes, which we have scattered everywhere throughout the body, the tonsils up here, and then the spleen, which is right here. Your red bone marrow is the first of the lymphatic organs that we're going to talk about today. It's, again, a primary lymphatic organ. Appears really thick like blood. So, when you're looking at it, it may not look like an organ, but it is considered an organ, just a very soft organ. And that's because it's separated from the bone tissue by the endosteum of the bone, which hopefully you remember is the inner layer of the bone. And red bone marrow is really important in the lymphatic system because it's the production site for all of our formed elements, including white blood cells. So red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets all make up our formed elements. But we're going to focus on white blood cells because we know that they have a huge part in our lymphatic and immune systems. Okay, so basically you can't see it here, but if you were in my lab, you know that a foramina is a hole. So arteries enter into the bone through this tiny little hole called the nutrient foramina. And those arteries are going to empty their blood supply into these spaces here called the sinusoids. So sinusoids are just they're not empty spaces because they have blood in them, but otherwise empty spaces in the bone marrow. And then the spaces between the sinusoids out here are occupied by hemopoietic tissue. Okay? So what happens is that as these blood cells are developed in the hemopoietic tissue, they're going to push through these endothelial cells that you see here and enter into the sinusoids, and that's how they enter into the bloodstream, right? Because our arteries and veins are connected to these sinusoids. The thymus is another really important organ in the lymphatic system. It's also part of the endocrine system, so I'm sure you guys are very familiar with it by now, hopefully. And again, it's the maturation site for T cells. So this is where our T cells go to become immunocompetent. It's located behind the sternum and in front of the aortic arch. We can see in this picture, it sits between each of the lungs and then on top of the heart. And I just wanted to reiterate how important it is in your immunity because we have this little blurb here about when young animals have their thymus removed, they never fully develop immunity, which can obviously be compromising for their health. And the other important information here is that organs of the lymphatic system, other organs of the lymphatic system besides the thymus, actually depend really heavily on different molecules, signaling molecules and hormones and factors like that that come from the thymus. And so if the thymus is removed or poorly developed, then that means that other organs of the lymphatic system will be poorly developed as well. So the lymph node, we've talked about this a little bit already. We'll get into a little bit more detail, but it's the most numerous lymphatic organ in your body. An adult has about 450 of them, and they're these little bean-shaped structures all over your body. They look like little red kidney beans, but they're about 3 centimeters long, sometimes less. They have afferent and efferent lymphatic vessels. So afferent lymphatic vessels bring lymph into the lymph node, and then the efferent lymphatic vessel will bring lymph out after it's been filtered. And so again, their job is to filter the lymph as it flows through. Okay, so it's going to come through this afferent lymphatic vessel. It's going to be cleansed, basically, or filtered inside of here. So the macrophages and reticular cells will cleanse 99% of the impurities, and then the lymph will leave through the efferent lymphatic vessel, back on its journey to re-enter into circulation. Okay, location of lymph nodes, they're very widespread, but we do have them concentrated in a few different regions of our body. So the cervical lymph nodes are up here in the neck. The axillary lymph nodes are in the armpit. The thoracic lymph nodes are not labeled in this picture, but obviously receive lymph from the thoracic region, like the lungs and the airways. The abdominal and mesentery lymph nodes are down here. Inguinal are right here, and then popliteal are behind the knee. And then also we have these nice pictures from the book. You can see right here and right here and right here. Those are some inguinal lymph nodes. And then also the mesentery lymph nodes are labeled in this picture here. Effects of disease on the lymph nodes. So lymphadenitis is basically when your lymph nodes are combating some sort of antigen and they become swollen and painful. So if you have a sore throat and you palpate the lymph nodes that are in your throat or your cervical region and you feel that they're swollen, that's because they're being challenged by an antigen. And then metastasis is another effect of disease on lymph nodes. So cancerous cells typically, metastasis is when they break away from their primary tumor and travel to other sites of the body so that they can establish new tumors. And so the lymphatic vessels are so permeable, which we saw when we were looking at the structure here. We have these overlapping endothelial cells that create these really big gaps, which makes these vessels really permeable. So what happens is these cancer cells can get into the lymphatic system really easily. And so typically what they'll do is they'll lodge themselves into one of the first nodes that they encounter and eventually destroy that node, which is referred to as lymphoma. So one of the first things that women deal with when they realize that they've developed a breast tumor is the doctors want to find out and make sure that the cancer cells haven't entered into the lymphatic system and haven't inhabited any of these nearby nodes, right? Because as we've seen, the vessels are really permeable, and if that happens, then the cancer can metastasize pretty quickly. Tonsils are patches of lymphatic tissue located at the back of your mouth, so to the entrance of the pharynx, and their job is to guard your body against any pathogens that you may be ingested or inhaled, and they contain these really deep pits that you see here. All right, and so those pits are lined by lymphatic nodules, so really densely populated lymphatic cells. And those pits can often contain food debris, dead white blood cells, bacteria, and then different chemicals. You have 3 sets of tonsils: pharyngeal tonsils, which are up here, palatine tonsils, which are the ones that you see when you open the back of your mouth. Those are most often infected. And when they do become inflamed, that's called tonsillitis, usually caused by strep throat. And then down here we have the lingual tonsils. And then the spleen is the last thing that we're going to talk about today. This is the body's largest lymphatic organ. I recorded a nice video for you guys for lab showing you how to find the spleen. This image is a little bit tricky. I don't know if this is like a human cadaver, if they took the digestive tract out, but basically the liver, and let's pretend it is a mink, the liver sits right here, across underneath the diaphragm, and then the spleen sits underneath the liver. It's going to be sort of on top of the kidney, so if you flip the spleen over to the left, the kidney will be to the right of it. That's your left kidney. And then the stomach would be over here if the digestive tract was there. So it sits between the kidney, the stomach, and the diaphragm, or in the case of your mink, the liver. It's made up of red pulp and white pulp. So red pulp is red. You see it down here in this tissue, just because it contains so many red blood cells. But the white pulp is all this stuff in here, and it contains lymphocytes, monocytes, and macrophages. So its job is basically, as the blood comes into the spleen through the splenic artery, it's going to monitor that blood for different foreign antigens and act as a filter. A splenectomy is when you have the spleen removed. So I've told you about my dog plenty of times. He did have a splenectomy and he's doing great. So people and animals can live without their spleen, but they are more susceptible to infections and premature death, which is evident after you've seen all of the different functions of these lymphocytes and other immune cells or lymphatic cells. Okay, so practice questions for this section. What are the primary functions of the lymphatic system? We talked about its function in returning fluid or recycling fluid. We also talked about its function in immunity, and then finally we talked about its function in lipid absorption. So tell me a little bit about each of those things. How does fluid get into the lymphatic system? So tell me about the structure of the lymphatic capillary. Remember, we talked about those overlapping endothelial cells. They're going to absorb a lot of fluid. So talk to me about how that happens, how they respond to different changes in pressure. What are the major cell types of the lymphatic tissue? So we talked about natural killer cells, B cells, T cells, dendritic cells, reticular cells. Tell me each of their functions, maybe group them into ones that have really similar functions. Identify the location and major function of all of these different lymphatic organs. So where are the lymph nodes generally densely populated? Where's the spleen, the thymus, the tonsils, and what are each of their jobs? Okay, so I'm going to finish this lecture here and then post another video for you guys of the second half of the lecture. So maybe if you want to do it all at once, you can do that, or you can kind of break it up however you want to do it.